I hate to be a harbinger of doom, but we ordered too many calendars this year. Last year we sold 500, and most of them were on election night. But this year, we got like, what, 6 or 10 election nights, and we can't man all of them. So we think we ordered 600 this year, we sold 500 last year. So we're in trouble. So if you got a spare $10 in your pocket, George is over there. He's not going to let you out the door until you
Thanks, Marty. So also, this is the time of year we're always asking for something, right? There's so many things going on, so many natural disasters and hungry folks and clothing and freezing and whatever, our calendar drive. So we also, don't forget, we're doing the hats and gloves. I brought a basket tonight. There are some hats and gloves in there. We have some already at the museum. We'll have our bin at the library November 4th through December 6th. And we'll sort them all out. We'll get them out to our 4 elementary schools. And I'll tell you, the nurses and the teachers, they stand there waiting for those deliveries once we get up there. So it's a good thing. So one more little thing, and I just wanted to mention, I sent a nice little card to Richard Goring to help cheer him up. Keep him in your thoughts, please. And Shannon is here tonight, so it affects her directly. So let's keep Richard in our thoughts. I also sent a card from the society to Elise. There's been like ups and downs with Donnie and Jill for months. And so they're doing good. And anybody that you know that may be under the weather or needs some cheering up, let us know, and we'll get a card out to them so they know that we're thinking of them. So I think we covered everything. Without any further, is there any questions about anything that we already covered? Thanks for coming out tonight too. We do have goodies in the back and water when you're in the mood. Tonight our guest speaker is our very own Hyde Parker, Shannon Butler. Shannon has quite an interesting history. She is currently the historian of, I wrote down Poughkeepsie Library. Poughkeepsie Public Library, that just doesn't sit well with me. It's Adrian's Memorial Library, as long as I've been alive, and I hope it still has that name. And Shannon is a Hudson Valley native, and she's, got 2 degrees from SUNY New Paltz and 1 from SUNY Albany in history. And she has a couple of blogs. She's written some papers and published a couple of books. And she has always supported us, and I'm sure if you live in the village of Hyde Park or even a little bit further around, you've seen her pedaling that bicycle around town, and even more so, her 3 little dogs walk her periodically around the neighborhood. So she does chase after them. But tonight she's going to talk to us about something, a famous place in Poughkeepsie, the Alms House, which is currently undergoing a lot of scrutiny, and there's a big push to keep that going. If you read the Poughkeepsie Journal, you know anything going on with that facility down in Poughkeepsie, they're also looking for support and help. So, no, Alms House. Yes. So, let us welcome our very own Shannon Butler. Thank you.
All right. Thanks very much for having me, guys. And also thank you very much for sending the card to my Rich. Very much appreciated. So tonight we're going to be taking a close look at a very much forgotten group of people. And by that I mean the poor. I have entitled this program Inmates because that was the term used to describe anyone who ended up in the Alms House. We see it most commonly on the census records, that they're inmates in the Alms House. And then, of course, in the record of inmates that we have in our collection, which is a very thick ledger, which we're going to be talking about tonight, there are lots of interesting terms used to describe some of the people who end up in the almshouse. Not all of them are pretty. I just want to mention that some of the terms I use tonight don't necessarily reflect our modern language to describe some of these folks. The reasons for ending up in the almshouse vary and range from everything from sickness to old age. Mental health crises, even pregnancy, can land you in the almshouse. So it's definitely a situation where don't judge lest ye be judged. But we have a rather large ledger in our collections with over 1,000 names within it. And this is not even a full list of the people who ended up in the almshouse. I was also able to find records at the Dutchess County Historical Society that did not match our ledger. So there's quite a lot of names. Some of these records are quite detailed, while some are lacking in information. In some cases, I was able to uncover fascinating stories about some of these individuals. And in other cases, I couldn't find so much as a mention that they even existed. Sometimes people come to me doing genealogical research, they're looking for an ancestor who they know had fallen on hard times, but they can't find any kind of evidence that this person ever existed. And that's because there's no written record that they ever did. And sometimes that's very much the case. Sometimes the only record that somebody ever existed was their name when they went into the almshouse for the night just to keep warm. So some of these people, the people who enter the almshouse are white, they're black, they're locally born, recently immigrated. They're as old as over 100 years old, as you see there, 107. They're as young as a few days. Some of them were born in the almshouse. Some couldn't be bothered to help themselves, while others were willing to do anything they could to get themselves off the streets. Using this ledger, along with census records, directories, newspaper articles, I've tried to put together the generally sad stories of some of these people. Now, when it comes to what they looked like, very rarely do you have photographs of people who ended up in the almshouse. It was very expensive, particularly in the 19th century, to have your photograph made. So if you did have your photograph made, and then you ended up in the almshouse later, that meant you fell on hard times. So I was not able to come across any photographs in our collection. We have a lot of photographs in our collection at the Adrian's Memorial Library. And yes, it is the Adrian's Memorial Library that I work out of. But now we have the Sadie Peterson Delaney Library, Boardman Road Branch Library, so we're a system now. But anyway, what I decided to do is can be considered somewhat controversial by some. I decided to benefit from the world of artificial intelligence, aka AI. Now, I've never used AI before. This was brand new for me. So I tried getting the help of one of my IT guys at the library, who plays with AI all the time, makes some really cool stuff. And he said, well, you just got to type in some terms of what you want the person to look like. I was like, okay, let me give it a try. So I tried just a random term, 1890s evil male chicken stealer in Poughkeepsie, New York. Okay, so that's kind of random. But there was a story behind that. And this is what I got. Oh. That's not what I was going for. My colleagues and I just died laughing. We were cracking up so bad. And we also got this. Nice little steampunk chicken. By the way, these will both make really good Halloween costumes if you're looking for a last second thing. This is it. But so then I went ahead and I decided to change my phrasing up a little bit because I'm like, that's not it. So then I went in and I got very specific. I said, okay, let's go with poor young white man in tattered clothes, running away, holding a chicken on the streets of Poughkeepsie in 1890. And that's what I got. I was like, oh, that's better. Yeah, that's about right. So the images that we're going to be looking at that I've attached to some of these stories are going to be the imagination of AI with the information that I have on each person put in. So just to kind of give you something to look at when we're talking about each story. But before we go into the stories of the people themselves, I first want to cover the history of the almshouse itself and how our state and our area handled the poorer population historically. So it wasn't until the 1820s when the state suddenly became concerned with the well-being of the poor. That's kind of late to think of the state's history overall. But the reasons for pauperism change depending on what time period you're focusing on. Like if we go back to the early settlement of the colony of New Netherland, New York, the reasons for becoming suddenly poor are things like smallpox epidemic or Native American attack on your village, things like that. Then we get to the later 18th century, you can add warfare to the mix, the French and Indian War, the American Revolution. Now you have veterans who are in need of housing or food or supplies, or widows of said veterans. So that's kind of adding to the reasons of pauperism. And then as we get into the 19th century, we find a much more varied mix of reasons for pauperism. Everything from high taxes, low wages, rise in immigration, coming into a system that's already taxed when it comes to employment issues. In 1778, New York state law required that towns and cities within the state provide their own services for the poor, so each town's got to do their own thing. The system was flawed at best. In some cases, people were clearly just taken advantage of entirely. In the late 18th century and early 19th century, the overseers of the poor had a few ways of dealing with the unfortunate population. First, you would examine each person's case to determine whether or not you should give them temporary relief in the form of money, food, fuel, and so forth to get them through the hard time. Or you could have someone, a local farmer, a local tavern owner, take in that person. And then they could work. And of course, with that, you can see where some abuse and the arrangement, the individual might be taken advantage of in some of those cases. Now, the Secretary of the State of New York, Mr. John Van Ness Yates, had reported on the conditions of the poor around the state and found many issues within the system. He concluded, quote, "The present poor laws tend to encourage the sturdy beggar and vagrant to become pensioners on the public funds." He went on to say, "Outdoor relief has blunted his proper instincts, unnerving the arm of industry and weakening the desire for honest independence." In other words, free handouts encourage the beggar to stay a beggar. Now there is also the issue of where is this person really from anyway? If the overseer of the poor determined that that person wasn't even from the area, then they would ship them off to the area that they were from and they can handle it. For example, here we have an order of removal from 1810 for a woman named Betsy Mines. Betsy Mines came into the overseer of the poor in 1810 and said, "I am poor." And they said, "Where are you from? Are you from here in Poughkeepsie?" "Oh no, I'm from Fishkill." "All right, send her butt back to Fishkill. Let her be. Then deal with that problem." That's what happened a lot. We have a lot of these orders of removal in our collection. Now things were changing in 1824 when New York State Assembly passed the County Poorhouse Act, a measure that directed that each county should erect one or more poorhouses for the care of the, quote, worthy poor. Expenses for building and maintaining such structures were to be paid by tax funds levied on by the county government. We can see here in this article from 1818 that the Poughkeepsie Journal is talking about the need to build a county poorhouse even before the state had actually gone ahead and made this, passed this act. However, things are pretty slow going in Poughkeepsie as a whole, historically. So here we go in 1829, March 25th, we see Poughkeepsie again stating the need to discuss a county poorhouse. And then finally in 1831, the creation of a county poorhouse on the eastern end of the then village of Poughkeepsie is finally agreed upon. Now, in a day book that actually belonged to a man named Amos Bryan, which is in the collections of the Dutchess County Historical Society, I drove up there and dug through their stuff too. we see this record here showing Elizabeth Parkinson was paid $3,293.12 for 59 acres of land. And then Misters Coombs and Potter were paid $4,050 for building the county poorhouse, with an additional note at the bottom that says, from which was deducted for deficiency of work $53.25. So somebody screwed up somewhere. All right. Sorry, my voice is giving out already. So this is a snippet from the 1834 map of Poughkeepsie. And we can see the Dutchess County Courthouse circled there in yellow on the end of the map, on the end of the village, all the way over here, little clump of trees there. Now, based on the location, it looks to be in the location which would eventually become the official Poughkeepsie Alms House. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in a second, but first it starts off as the Dutchess County Poorhouse. There is a difference. Now, I also wanted to point out up here, there's a little building called the Pest House. Now, that's not where the most particularly annoying poor people go. That is actually where people who have infectious diseases go. So cholera, typhoid fever, things like that. And I believe that this poorhouse was probably built about 1832, because that year there was a major cholera outbreak in Poughkeepsie. In less than a week, 50 people died in the poorhouse alone from that outbreak. So I'm imagining that's when they went ahead and built that pest house. In the summer and fall of 1843, well-known humanitarian Dorothy Dix traveled throughout New York and examined the conditions of each poorhouse. She had very glowing things to say about the Dutchess County Poorhouse when she got here. She said the Dutchess County Poorhouse at Poughkeepsie is a model of neatness and good discipline. The household arrangements are excellent. The kitchens and cellars complete in every part. I have seen nothing in the state so good as these. It's not bad, right? Dutchess County Poorhouse is functioning quite well. Here we see the superintendent's report published in the Poughkeepsie Journal, and this is in 1846, showing that people in the home that year was 227. The population for Dutchess County at that time period was about 50,000, the whole county wide. We also see that they are producing and consuming quite a lot of goods on a farm that they have here, which includes 1,300 heads of cabbage, 40 bushels of cucumbers, 600 bushels of oats. They also have cows, pigs, chickens. It's a fully functioning farm. It's kind of hard to imagine a fully functioning farm in the city of Poughkeepsie today, but it was there then. We also see the amount of money that was needed to be raised in order to be continuing the same standards of care for the poor. Now, it was during the 1840s when the various political parties, the Whigs and the Democrats, or the Loco-Focos, as the Whigs called them, were fighting back and forth over exactly how to run the poorhouse and how to save the taxpayers' money. Now, the Whigs were for a much more centralized form of government, and they believed that the poor should be continued to remain in one main location in the county, one spot. And I feel like this is probably the best way to do this when it comes down to it. The Democrats, they wanted the poor to kind of spread out in various poorhouses in various towns. In the long run, the easiest way is to ensure that in order to ensure the same amount of care, you have to keep everything in a centralized location. The same location where you have access to medicine, teaching opportunities, as well as money coming in and not being dispersed all over the place. However, the drawback of having everybody in the same location is the possibility of overcrowding in that location. There appears to have been a lot of tension between the city of Poughkeepsie and the county of Dutchess. You don't say. Things don't change. As Edmund Platt put it in his book, History of Poughkeepsie, he said, quote, "During the war," meaning the Civil War, by the way, "a feeling of antagonism between the city and county resulted in the proposition before the Board of Supervisors to remove the county courthouse to the interior of the county. The most likely reason for this tension, by the way, was other towns in Dutchess County were tired of paying for a facility whose population was mostly City of Poughkeepsie residents. Most of the people who are going into the Dutchess County Courthouse are Poughkeepsie people. So I might imagine the people high up going, hey, why are we paying so many tax dollars when we only got like 2 or 3 people in the Alms house? When there's like 80 people in Poughkeepsie living there. So it's legitimate. Since Poughkeepsie was so much bigger and more accessible to many of the interior towns in the county, it's only natural that the poor population would be higher, which is very much the same way today. So the Common Council set a committee to discuss with the Dutchess County Board of Supervisors on January 19, 1863. And at that meeting, the brand new Commissioners of the Poor was established for just the city of Poughkeepsie. And they purchased the old county poorhouse on the end of town to become the official new city of Poughkeepsie, Alms House. They called it the Alms House instead of the poorhouse, and later on the name would be changed to the City Home. So same name, different names for the same purpose. Whereas the county decided to move their operations out towards Millbrook and built a new Dutchess County poorhouse. The names changed, but the city took over the old Dutchess County poorhouse and would continue to run it until February 7th, 1868. Now, why did they stop running it on February 7th, 1868? Glad you asked. Around 12:30 p.m., George Wirt, a black man who worked as a cook in the kitchen, heard a yell come from the, quote, crazy room, as the newspaper called it, which was not apparently quite the same yell as normally would come from the crazy room. The newspaper article read, becoming startled, the cook ran from the kitchen when he was met by a German inmate who said that the building was on fire. Now, what makes this so interesting is that the Poughkeepsie Journal, who I think perhaps you'll remember, their tagline was neutral in nothing. They didn't hide their joy from the loss of this building, as we can see here. They write, at last, Poughkeepsie is rid of the disgraceful, shabby-looking rookery, which was located on the road to Bull's Head on the suburbs, and which of late had been given the only dignity it ever possessed by being called the City Alms House. It was an outrageous-looking affair, and as strangers who visited our city drove by it on their way into the country or to visit Vassar Cottage, it would make even the hack driver blush to answer their inquiries as to what the building was used for. But every dog has his day, and the City Alms House, which was, is not. I love old school Poughkeepsie Journal. They didn't mince words. In fact, they wrote so beautifully. Not like today. So they were very excited that the old house burned down, which now meant that they can get themselves a much prettier looking Alms house. And what's interesting though, the article goes on to mention that though the fire was raging, there was plenty of time to get everybody out, including some of the furniture and bedding. So it sounds very suspicious. In our collections, we have an account book, and in it is the building record of the new Alms house. It appears that they wasted no time in requesting money from the insurance company and gathering what funds they had available for the construction of the new Alms house. They turned to one of the area's young architects, J.A. Wood, to design their new building. J.A. Wood was responsible for a couple other fabulous buildings in the area, including the Bardavon Opera House, the Vassar Brothers Institute, and the Old Men's Home just across the street from that. So he was well known in the area as a prominent architect. As we can see from the record, the commissioner of the Alms House in the city of Poughkeepsie, Mr. Jacob Jewett, paid J.A. Wood what appears to be a grand total of $750 for the design. And he designed this beautiful Italianate-style brick structure, which was no longer an eyesore, instead quite a remarkable building. This is a modern-day photograph that I took of the building, which can be seen as you're heading west on the arterial. That's if you're going the speed limit on the arterial, just so you're aware. If you blink, you miss it. So I went ahead and I was quite fortunate to be allowed access to the building. So I have to thank very much Fran, who's the manager of the property today. I showed up just wanting to take pictures of the exterior of the property. So I go in and I go to the manager's office, and I have my library employee name tag on, but I was like, hi there, I don't know if you know me, but my name is Shannon Butler, and I'm an historian for the Poughkeepsie Public Library District. And she goes, oh, I know you, yes, I know, I've seen your programs. I'm like, oh, cool. So I said, I'm doing research on your fabulous facility here, its history. And I was like, I was just wondering if you're not, I'm just going to take some pictures of the outside. She's like, oh, here's the keys, go ahead, they'll each and every building. Oh, cool. She's like, just bring it up when you're done. It was amazing. You dropped the word historian, and everyone's like, oh, you're good. Come on in. So that was kind of neat. Got the chance to kind of walk around the grounds, walk inside the building, and see a little bit of everything. Now, when it comes to the overall layout of the place, the building back in its heyday, we turned to an article from the Poughkeepsie Journal from January of 1869, which describes the new building. It says, the building's west wing was the superintendent's residence. In the center, we have a dining hall at the basement level. Also in the basement level is the kitchen. On the second and third floors are an office, a workspace. This is an interior view of the hallway on the inside today. There are apartments today. Assisted living apartments and Section 8 apartments, so nice little complex. And very well looked after and taken care of. There were two separate wings to keep the sexes apart. Men and women were in separate dormitory areas. They got together at mealtime, but they even had separate yards in the back fenced off to, I guess, prevent more poor. This is a Sanborn map, one of the Sanborn insurance maps, which we have in our collection. And the facility, the max capacity was about 150, but it never appears to have had more than that. They were never overcrowded at the Alms house, which is good. But this Sanborn map is from 1913, so we can see the separate building. The annex, which was added a little bit later. Then it kind of grows over time. More wings were added, a laundry house was added, an infirmary was added, another wing for more dormitory space. The superintendent's residences on this side of the building, male ward, female ward, and some extra wards added over time. Now, in 1907 is when this infirmary building was added here, and this is a architect's drawing, kind of a fuzzy architect's drawing from the Poughkeepsie Journal. William Smith of the Smith Brother Cough Drop fame actually donated the money for the creation of the infirmary. And of course, here's the building today, which is still on the campus. It actually became sometimes a city hospital for us. And it was particularly used during the outbreak of the Spanish flu in 1918. So there was quite a lot of people being housed there for that. A wing was added to the back of this building. Their FDR's administration, the WPA, added a whole other wing, doubling the size of the hospital. So now you have the poorhouse. When I was in the basement of the poorhouse, I was able to find this plaque mentioning that William Smith had given the funds for the creation of it. So that was kind of neat. So now you have the poorhouse, right? You have the city poorhouse where you can house those in need. So when it comes to caring for those who enter it, what guidelines must you follow? Well, certainly every superintendent throughout the state would have had this book somewhere in his office. These are the poor laws of New York State, which remained more or less the same throughout the 19th century. They didn't really change. So let's say if we turn to page 82, we can see how to care for habitual drunkards, which is one of the big issues, believe it or not, for ending up in the Alms house, including forbidding others to serve liquor to these individuals. Or if we can turn to another page where we can see how to care for bastards. Again, a term that we might not necessarily use that much these days, unless we're I'm referring to somebody who cut us off on the arterial. But no, this is of course referring to children who are born out of wedlock, of course. And this, one of the things they suggest doing is hunting down the possible father and bringing him in for questioning. If we turn to page 149, we can see how to deal with lunatics, as the word was used at the time. Again, not a term we generally use unless yelling at somebody who cut us off from the arterial. But this is another, some way to point out some of the words that have surfaced at the time. And the really very clear issue of dealing with mental health at that time period, which was far below our current standards. And even still, we're still working that out. But before 1871, when the Hudson River State Hospital for the Insane was developed, as they called it back then, there was no place to send people who were having mental breakdowns. Before 1871, you went to the Alms house, whether you were poor or just suffering from a mental breakdown. So that's something I wanted to point out. Now these New York State poor laws were written by men who clearly had never been poor a day in their lives. They never knew no poverty. Their lives were pretty sweet. They never witnessed the hardships of migration, unemployment, mental health crises, or, God forbid, unwanted pregnancies. So these laws weren't always suitable. When it came to the overall care of the poor in Poughkeepsie, not everyone needed to go to the Alms house. It should be noted that there was also a thing called outdoor relief, which was always cheaper on the taxpayer than indoor relief, as we see from these records here. This is a report from 1882 showing the total expenses for outdoor relief that year as $3,407.81. And that includes helping to pay for maybe someone's rent, medical costs, provisions, fuel costs, and so forth, while taking in individuals and caring for them year-round in the Alms house was well over $7,000. So that's double what it would cost for just outdoor relief. Now we're also keeping track of the police reports. I thought it would be interesting to compare police reports with the Alms records reports to see what sort of things are landing people in the Alms house. So I went ahead and used the same record, the 1882 cause of pauperism. We're gonna take a look here at the cause of pauperism. Intemperance, right, drinking too much, debauchery, vagrancy, idiocy, lunacy. What's it going to do? Idiocy and lunacy, I'm not sure. Lameness, sickness, bastardy, yeah, all sorts of reasons, all sorts of hardships for ending up in the Alms house. So if we compare that to the police records, some of these ways of ending up in a police report are interesting. Ball playing? What the heck? You got arrested for ball playing? At least one of you did, anyway. There's keeping disorderly house and keeping a house of ill fame. What the heck's the difference? I mean, keeping a house of ill fame sounds pretty awesome. Disorderly house, no, you gotta have order in the house, but ill fame? No. Yeah, and then seduction. That's another thing you could be arrested for, apparently. I mean, based on the amounts of women who are being seduced and then they got pregnant and ending up in the Alms house, that record is way off. It should be way more than just one. So, I'm just saying, these aren't terribly accurate. But those are some of the reasons for arrests in Poughkeepsie in 1882. Now, let's take a look at some of the stories. Some of the research that I did, basically what I would do is I would grab one of the records from the ledger that we have. It was really detailed, like all the information was there. I would try to look up that person's history in the census records, and then I would try to look up their history if they were written about in the newspapers, and see what I could come across, try to put together a family story. In some cases, I couldn't find anything at all. This was a painstaking research project that took months and months, almost a year, actually. And my coworkers were always intrigued, especially when I would suddenly pipe up and go, "Oh my God, this is amazing!" And then everybody would come running and go, "What should we do now?" about my research, and I was telling him. And he's like, have you found any happy endings? I'm like, oh, no, I haven't. He's like, could you find a happy ending somewhere? So, unfortunately, I did not find any happy endings. So just when I thought I was getting close, like, oh, this guy's doing good. He's out of the Alms house. He's got a job. Oh, he committed suicide. Okay, no, not doing that well. So, there's no easy way of saying it. These are not happy stories. So let's start off with Mary H. Gray. She entered the Alms house on February 5th, 1876. She was female, 18 years old. She was black. This young girl had clearly been through a lot. She was the daughter of Matilda and Thomas Gray and was born in 1858 here in Poughkeepsie. Now, in the remarks in her ledger, it says that her father and brother died while serving in the U.S. Army during the Civil War. As I did a little digging, it turns out this was true. Her brother, John Gray, enlisted in Poughkeepsie in April 1863, and he served in the famous 54th Massachusetts, which was made famous by the movie Glory. He was captured during the famous battle that's depicted in the film, the Battle of Fort Wagner, which of course the 54th lost heavy casualties in that battle. He ended up dying in the old Charleston jail, because a lot of these prisoners ended up in the old Charleston jail just after the battle. Her father died in 1865. He had also signed up and served, but he died from sickness while he was stationed down in New Orleans. So this loss undoubtedly affected the family. They would certainly have suffered from both the major male figures in the family not being able to support them. She was 12 years old, Mary, when she and her 10-year-old sister ended up becoming servants and employed for Dr. Edward Bolton, whose home was on Academy Street in Poughkeepsie. At some point, she had a nervous breakdown, and she was sent to the Hudson River State Hospital for the insane at the time. She appears to have spent some time there, and then eventually ended up going back to work, but that was too much, and then ended up going to the Alms house. When she ended up in the Alms house, and this is my AI's version of her, when she ended up in the Alms house, they decided that she was too mentally far gone, and they sent her to the Hudson River State Hospital where she eventually died, sometime after 1876. In May of 1877, Elias Tribbett, a 40-year-old druggist, checked in to the Alms house. In his remarks, in the entry, it reads, "This person has been well brought up. His father was one of the first citizens of Poughkeepsie, and his family was considered one of the first in the city. But the use of strong drink has brought Elias here. His father was Dr. Elias Tribbett Sr. He was a well-respected physician in the city of Poughkeepsie. He had actually also been on the board of directors of the Poughkeepsie Collegiate Institute, which was the boys' college on top of what's now known as College Hill. He was one of the founders of that institution. Now, his son Elias graduated from college and became a pharmacist and worked for his father. However, in 1863, he decided to enlist and serve in the war. He ended up serving as a hospital steward for the Union Army. That was a tough job. No doubt he saw some terrible things during the war. The hospital steward was in high demand. They served as a druggist, a chemist, an assistant to the surgeons. He would have seen horrible things. When he came back after serving his country, his father died, and it appears that Elias hit the bottle pretty hard. He ended up spending most of 1877 in the Alms house, leaving and then returning again in 1879, which is also when he died. He died in September of 1879 from consumption or tuberculosis. He's buried in the family's burial plot at Poughkeepsie Rural Cemetery. So some of these people who come from wealth initially are easy to find, and their records are there. Others, maybe not so much. There are quite a lot of mentions of Civil War veterans who suffered from various ailments, never properly cared for, right? PTSD was not a recognized thing at the time. And if a veteran had come home and then, say, succumb to alcoholism, which is very common, the result of something that he experienced during the war, of course. He was just given the same term that any drunk individual was given, and they would receive the mark of intemperance on his record. He's intemperate. Never mind the fact that he had served his country and seen some horrible things. For example, John Tillieu, age 64, entered the Alms house on November 20th, 1901, from sickness. The reporter wrote in the book, quote, "This man has been very intemperate, drunk most of the time, was a soldier in the War for the Rebellion from 61 to 62. It was also mentioned that he had received a pension of $14 per month, but he died in the Alms house on January 11, 1902. Another veteran arrived in 1901, a guy named James Hewitt, age 74. His remarks read, "This man was in Company C of the 128th New York State Volunteers during the War of the Rebellion. He is drawing $8 per month in pension, and that he was driven from his home by his children. He had 10 children. None of them wanted him in the house." So the family was living on number 26 Church Street. And since the family didn't want to take care of him, they didn't want his problems, they kicked him out. This veteran who had served his country. And he died at the Alms house 2 weeks later. So there's a lot of family turmoil going on in some of this as well. Another man who had served in the Civil War came out of it with a desire to turn to a life of crime. When I came across this entry, which reads, "James P. Williams, this man is a chicken thief," I had to learn how he had earned such a title. And let me tell you, it did not disappoint. Beginning in 1869, he was involved in a major robbery and was sent to Sing Sing prison, where he eventually was sent to Clinton prison, where he said he did, quote, "easy time," and was let out on good behavior in 1879. He claimed that he was trying to get his military pension so he could get a fair start at once and open up a shoe business. Now, in 1880, I did find him in the directories as a shoemaker in Poughkeepsie. But that didn't last long, because in 1883, he was arrested again, indicted for conspiracy to obtain money by false pretenses, and sent to Albany Penitentiary for 6 months. In 1890, he was charged with stealing chickens and sent to Albany Penitentiary for 6 months. We have our first mention of a chicken thievery. There will be more. Somehow, in the midst of all these trips to prison and shoemaking and chicken stealing, James managed to get married. But it doesn't appear to have worked out, because in July of 1898, both James and his wife were arrested for drunkenness and vagrancy, and James was referred to as a first-class fraud. In August of 1893, James is accused of stealing chickens for a second time. Oh, James. And this is where, when I'd be sitting in my office researching this guy, digging things up, my colleagues would be sitting there like, "Oh, James, my man, what are you doing?" And everybody's like, "Oh no, what do you do now?" They know exactly what I was researching. He's still a living chicken. There's a lot of that going on. So anyway, he finally ended up in the Alms house in 1901, where he died. Here he is, again, charged with stealing more stuff. Oh, and his wife, he's in first class from here, yeah, that's right. More chicken stealing. I found a ton of stuff, I'm telling you. This guy was living his best life, I guess. But he died in the Alms house on February 17, 1902. And he's buried in an unmarked grave in the Poughkeepsie Rural Cemetery. But I joked with my friend Brian Berrien, who's the superintendent of the Poughkeepsie Rural Cemetery. I said, "You know, you really should just get a stone shaped like a chicken. Put it right where you think he is." He's like, "That's an interesting thought." Anyway, Jacob Beaver, a man with zero respect for people and their property, it would seem, entered the Alms house on September 27, 1886, at the age of 43. What is interesting in for his cause of repentance, which is listed as St. Vitus dance. Yeah, that's what I said. What? What the heck is that? Basically, it's Huntington's disease. That was the term. term at the time. A neurological disorder that messes with your muscle control and cognitive abilities. And eventually, it kills you. That's what it does. So it appears that this is what happened to Jacob. But I was unable to find anything about him after he landed in the almshouse, but it doesn't appear that anybody took notice of his demise because he had been so well known for causing trouble for so many years. Quite literally every mention I found of Jacob Beaver was a bad one. As you can see here, he's a notorious thief. He's been in the state prison 3 or 4 times. And indeed he was in 1877, here he is being arrested for cruelty to animals. So yeah, as far as I'm concerned, he's a monster. Here he is in 1880, he's being arrested for stealing a horse. Here he is being transferred from Sing Sing to Auburn prison. A little field trip for Mr. Beaver. Here he is in the Poughkeepsie jail. What's interesting about this is that all the guys that are in the Poughkeepsie jail have normal careers. Laborer, insurance, laborer, boatman, but not our boy Beaver. Look, he's just a thief. That's little Taylor, black, thief. That is all the Beaver is. So, okay. Charles McKay is another troublemaker who regularly found himself either in jail or in the almshouse. And towards the end of his life, he clearly preferred the former. He was born sometime around 1850. By the time he was in his early 20s, he was abusing local police officers. He even seriously injured his own father by stabbing him and kicking him. Here we see him, he's in his, here we see in the almshouse right here, you can see how many times he's checking in and checking out of the almshouse. He's always in and out of the almshouse for various reasons. He's apparently intemperate and known for stealing, but what really gets me is this article from 1919, where he's requesting that they take him out of the almshouse and put him in jail instead. His reasoning is because he doesn't have to do chores when he's in jail. When you're in the almshouse, you have to work if you're capable. Whether it's harvesting from the farm or taking care of the cows or chickens or cooking, you have to contribute. But if you're in jail, you don't have to do anything. So he actually asked the judge to send him to jail. And the judge is like, nah, you're staying in the almshouse. The amount of women who ended up in the almshouse because their husbands were total pieces of fill in the blank is astounding. The amount of women who were promised marriage, but then were seduced and became pregnant is staggering. Because of irresponsible men, many young women ended up in the almshouse, sometimes pregnant and most certainly terrified. For example, we have a 23-year-old Mary Bauer, who was born in Staten Island and had apparently done well as a servant down there. As the record states, quote, "This girl is a splendid servant, but having been led astray by a villain who seduced her, she commenced drinking and having no friends in the city was compelled to come to the almshouse." We find another servant girl, also 23 years old, also pregnant. However, this one had just come to this country a year before from Germany. Her name was Joanna Gack. And the remark reads, "This girl seems to have been well brought up. Coming to this country a stranger, was easily led astray under the promise of marriage and was seduced." Another seduction. The fact that there's only one seduction in the police records, it's not sitting right. Anyway, she was seduced, and we can see that she ends up in the almshouse, and she's pregnant. The only record I can find of her is that she had been working for a wealthy family on Academy Street as a domestic servant. Now, the superintendent of the almshouse, or in some cases his wife, because the family of the superintendent would live in the almshouse, the wife would have helped in the process of checking in each person that came. Since the family of the superintendent lived on the property, the wife would be writing down some of these thoughts in these books. We can only imagine how she felt when, say, a well-known prostitute walked in. For example, Elizabeth Diamond. Again, age 23. I don't know what it is about 23-year-old women in Poughkeepsie. She's originally from Ireland. She's not educated. She's listed here as a prostitute with 2 illegitimate children. There were a few mentions in the newspapers in the 1870s and 80s of raids that occurred of, quote, disorderly houses, what we refer to as brothels. Interestingly enough, all the brothels are on Church Street, and all the churches are on Hooker Avenue. Don't know how that works, but okay. So anyway, she's in one of these disorderly houses that was raided, and she came to the Alms house when she was pregnant. Sometimes women just came running into the Alms house in order to get away from their drunk or abusive husbands. In 1877, a shoemaker named Patrick Ward was arrested for assaulting his wife. And a couple years later, that same wife entered the Alms house with 3 kids on her arms. The remarks in the book read, "This woman's husband is intemperate, and she is high-tempered and quarrels continually." Well, maybe she quarrels because her husband's abusive. So anyway, there's a lot of hard times, especially when a woman's coming in with 3 kids. And in some cases, the kids would be separated from the mother, especially if you've got a boy, he's going to the male ward, the girls are going to the female ward. It was definitely tough on kids who ended up here either with their parents or without. Take, for example, a 9-year-old girl named Anne Sullivan. She was dropped off in the Alms house in July of 1880 after her mother was arrested for running a disorderly house on, Church Street. The report read, "This child is the illegitimate daughter of Mary Sullivan, a notorious character who is now in the penitentiary. Anne's mother was apparently a real troublemaker, and in 1881, she was sent to the Albany Penitentiary for 6 months for drunkenness and using obscene language." I'm glad obscene language is no longer a crime. I'd be in trouble. There is a record book in the collections of the Visitors County Historical Society, which is a treasure trove of sad stories of the children who ended up in the Alms house. This book is a record of the children who were coming in and were later disposed of by the superintendent in various ways. And I noticed some trends. If a child was black and no immediate family members could be located, then the child was immediately shipped off to a black orphanage in New York City at 143rd and 10th Avenue. It was assumed that there was no way that the child would be adopted in Poughkeepsie because they were black. Another trend was that if the child were Irish or German or simply unwanted, they might become indentured servants. Take, for example, William Hildebrand, 12 years old, of Irish heritage. He was taken by H.C. Harrison, who was the superintendent of the streets of Poughkeepsie, and he was going to work in the streets, doing work for him. When he was done with him, another person came to take him, Miss L. Niver, who took him to the Ancrum lead mines, where he would work there, which undoubtedly was not fun for a child. Now you might be asking yourself, can they do that? Is that even legal? Of course it is. Let's just turn to page 148 of the laws of the superintendents of the poor, where there's actually an indenture form right in the book that allows the superintendent to ship the child off to work as an indentured servant. Because child labor laws were definitely not a thing, not until the Fair Standards Act of 1938. Now imagine you and your friend are walking your dogs down Mill Street in 1907, when suddenly your dog finds something stirring in the leaves below. He goes to sniff the object, and suddenly cries of a newborn are heard. Well, that's exactly what happened on November 7, 1907, when 2 friends were walking down Mill Street, and their dog discovered a newborn baby in the leaves. No clothes, just covered in leaves. They took the baby to a nearby home, and then the baby was taken to the Alms house. The newspaper here reads, "The new inmate will probably live." She did not. She died a few days later. The mother of the child, who had been missing in action, was eventually found and was determined that she had been working as a servant for the superintendent of the Poughkeepsie Memorial Cemetery, John McGlasson. Somehow she got pregnant. We'll never know the exact details as to how that happened, but we can assume that nobody wanted her around anymore because she was sent down to Inwood, the so-called House of Mercy, which was meant for, quote, fallen women. Now there was the notorious Mary McCann. She was in and out of the Alms house quite regularly, as she couldn't seem to keep away from troublemaking and alcohol. Here we have her in 1902, drunk and fighting with her husband Peter. She tossed some furniture out the window of the house. Here she is in 1907 for intoxication, and she was sentenced to home. Here again in January of 1909, creating a disturbance at the Arlington Saloons. And again in 1911, here she is drinking at Little Smith Street, ending up in the city court. Oh, here she is again, you get the point. She's just not doing that well. Of course, the trend of people coming into the Alms house was overwhelmingly older individuals. Folks who could no longer work because of sickness, arthritis, their vision is going, various diseases and illnesses that have caught them in the end of their life. If you didn't have a savings or nest egg of any kind, what's going to happen to you? There's no proper health care system back then to take care of you. John Harrington, age 92, originally from Ireland, he claimed that his son had sent him money to travel to the U.S. And when he arrived, he was not able to locate his son. So he lived in a one-room shanty on Gifford Avenue near Duane Street in Poughkeepsie. In this newspaper article from 1880, it says, he places his age around 90 years old, but it is thought that he exaggerates. Neighbors saying that he is not over 80. He has lived alone and eked out a precocious existence by gathering rags and street refuse. On February 17, 1880, he fainted over his stove and landed somewhat on top of the stove, burning himself. He became delirious. He was sent to the Alms house, where he died in 1884. Fanny Smith was 66 years old and could hardly see when she entered the Alms house on April 11, 1887. She claimed that she was born in Germany, but had been here in the U.S. for 21 years. Friends of hers had paid for her her admission to the old ladies' home, now known as the Vassar Warner home. She stayed there for 4 months, and the staff of the old ladies' home learned that she had been raised Jewish, so they kicked her out. Now, that is what Fanny Smith had said when she entered the Alms house in 1877. Now, I decided to do some digging. And I looked at the reports from the old ladies' home, which we have in our collection. And I found in 1876, that, quote, Fanny Smith, who entered December 1876, was dismissed, not having been a resident of the city of Poughkeepsie for 5 years previous to entering. That's what they claimed their reason was, not that she had been raised Jewish, but that she hadn't been a resident for Poughkeepsie for 5 years. However, I have reason to believe both of those reasons are true. If we read the bylaws of the old ladies' home, it clearly states no person shall be admitted as beneficiary to this home without a written order from this committee, nor unless she is a respectable aged indigent Protestant woman of the age of not less than 60 years and unable to support herself, who has been an actual resident of the city of Poughkeepsie for 5 years. So both reasons go along with their bylaws. You gotta be Protestant, and you gotta be a resident of Poughkeepsie for 5 years. So that was their reasoning for kicking her out. And she died in the Alms house November 11, 1886. So I wanted to show you this comparison. Not long after Miss Fanny Smith had entered the Alms house, this report came out showing the numbers received during the year 1877. And if you look carefully, you will see that Poughkeepsie is the third highest, being beaten only by the New York City and Brooklyn almshouses, as far as the amount of people staying in the almshouse. Now I want to kind of skip a little bit to one of the really interesting characters that I have. Here we go, this guy. This story is quite intriguing. Mr. Levi P. Childs. He entered the Alms house February 18th, 1905, and died there on April 1st, 1907. He claimed that he was born on March 4th, 1798, in Ellicott Mills, just outside of Baltimore, Maryland. Now, his parents had been enslaved by Colonel John Ellicott in Baltimore, Maryland. And he said that he learned the art of carpentry as a young boy, and therefore he immediately became a very valuable enslaved person because he would trade. He said that he had been sold quite a few times back and forth as a young man, bringing in a price as high as over $2,000 per sale. That's pretty good. He claimed that he was married at least 4 times during his young life, and that most of his wives had died from harsh treatment from their enslavers. He claimed that after 24 years of working extra days and saving up his money, he was finally able to buy himself for $2,000 and buy his freedom. And he made his way to Washington, D.C., where he worked as a barber at the famous City Hotel. While employed there, he said he had the chance to shave many a famous head, including that of Andrew Jackson. He remembered him giving him a $5 gold piece. Ironically, he also claimed that he shaved the head of General Robert E. Lee just before going off to, quote, with the Yankees. Childs was too old when the Civil War broke out to enlist, but he claimed that he joined the 91st New York Volunteers at the age of 68. He doesn't show up on the muster rolls, though, which makes this a little hard to prove. Now, are all names on muster rolls? No, not necessarily. But he also claimed that he was wounded at the Battle of Gettysburg. The only problem is his regiment, the New York 91st Volunteers, was not at the Battle of Gettysburg. So that's another kind of issue that I find with his story. Some of his stories he told were very just hard to find proof of. But after the war, he worked as a barber and operated shops in Pittsfield and Springfield, Massachusetts, and then up in Albany, New York. I found all of those. He even went out to Syracuse in 1888 before relocating to Kingston, New York. And sometime around 1890, he operated a barber shop on North Front Street in Kingston, which is true. Finally, in 1901, at the age of 103, he came to Poughkeepsie, hoping that the Queen City would give him more of an opportunity in his older age. Well, sadly no. He went on to say that he was having a hard time attracting customers. He said, quote, "We let colored men come here, and the white men won't come on that account." He went on to prophesy. He said, "It's the color line that keeps my race so poor, and it's a problem that the American people will need years to solve." He's not wrong. On February 18, 1905, he ended up signing in the Alms house. The clerk who took down his information in the ledger did not believe any of what Mr. Childs was saying. You can see at the bottom, it reads, "This man is a fraud." He did not believe any of Mr. Childs' story. Over 60 years after Mr. Childs had seen his name written down in the slave ledger in Maryland, he had come up this way to see his name written down again as a fraud. Mr. Childs lived out his days at the Alms house and died on April 1st, 1907. He is buried in the old singles section of Poughkeepsie Rural Cemetery in an unmarked grave. So, there's a lot of really fascinating characters. I do want to cover one more intriguing. Here we go. This one's funny because it actually comes up to Hyde Park for a hot second. Catherine Kankarska. She seemed to despise being any place where there was a high fence holding her back. Even at 52, she managed to scale both the fence at St. Anne's home in Albany and the fence at the Alms house. AI really did me a doozy with this one. Yeah. She's a character. Now, somehow, in 1914, she managed to scale the fence at the Poughkeepsie Alms house and walked all the way up to Hyde Park, where she landed at the home of our very own town physician, Dr. Cronk. Cronk thought that she was insane and had escaped from the Hudson River State Hospital, so he sent her back. She does pop up about a month later again. This time, she killed 3 cats, and she earned 25 cents a piece to do it. I have questions. First, who's paying people 25 cents a cat to kill them? second, where's the SPCA in all this? They existed at the time. SPCA and Dutch mechanics weren't all this in the country. They're not saying anything about this? I don't know. Anyway, she's scaling fences, getting out of alms houses, getting out of insane asylums, causing all kinds of trouble, even here in Hyde Park. I found this article from 1905, which just cracked us up. Who killed the chickens? Someone at the city home rivals Hamlet's father, who did murder most foul. I know. Poughkeepsie Journal. They didn't mess around back then. 18 chickens were killed on the Alms House property. However, remember the Alms House had a self-sustainable farm, livestock. And the article goes on to mention that there had not been a chicken dinner at the Alms House for some time. Usually, the superintendent would put together fancy dinners on special occasions for the inmates. And apparently there had been a long, stale run of no chicken dinners, so apparently one of the inmates, quote, took this method of dropping a hint, as it were. So what else can you do with 18 dead chickens but have yourself a fine roast? On a more serious note, the City Alms House, in all of its years of operation, I've never come across any mentions of mistreatment or improper conditions of the facility and its inmates. There was never, all the records and reports were all quite good. Now here we have some photos of the interior. Now this, we're getting a little bit later here. But the Roosevelt administration and the gift of Social Security and other programs to help people, both elderly and those in financial hardships, the general thought by the 1950s was that there was less need for an alms house. It was sort of fading away from the community. The property became known as the City Home Welfare Department for a time in the mid-20th century. You see images here of it. Now, eventually, by the 1970s, it was closed down entirely. The building sat abandoned for less than a decade until it was purchased by a firm called Boston Investment and Development Company in the 1980s. An agreement was made by the city and the firm to allow for the Poughkeepsie Public Library District to operate a branch there, which we did for quite a while. Here we see the company making improvements to the site and restoring some of the old structures, including the laundry house in the center there. Here we can see they're working on the basement level, putting in new pipes and new electrical lines. And if we fast forward to today, here's that same view. Now, true to its original purpose, the majority of the property is currently used as Section 8 and senior housing. This image here shows some of the earliest people to have moved in the 1980s, Mr. and Mrs. Fiorello. By the way, Mrs. Fiorello still lives there. She's 98 years old in this modest but comfortable apartment. And, of course, here's the building today. Now, the complex is very well maintained and still has several of the original outbuildings that have been repurposed. This small building here at the center, right here, is the old laundry house. Here's another view of it. There's a patio here with tables and chairs for hanging out outdoors. That's where the manager's office is, and a little dining hall and a hangout area, TVs and stuff. In the back of the property is the stables and carriage barn. One is now an attorney's office, and the other one is Mill Street Loft Arts. Now, this brings us to our current crisis. Now, as a historian, I don't usually talk about modern day issues. But in this case, they are one and the same. I wanted to share with you some of the United Way's numbers for ALICE households. Now, if you don't know what ALICE is, it's an acronym for Assisted Limited Income Constrained Employed. It represents a growing number of families who are unable to afford basic housing, childcare, food, transportation, healthcare, and technology. These workers often struggle to keep their own households from financial ruin while keeping our local communities running. These are workers. These are people with jobs. There are over 118,000 households in Dutchess County, 25% of which meet ALICE qualifications. 10% are in poverty. If we break it down by town, here you see the number of households and the percentage of households below the ALICE threshold. We have the city of Poughkeepsie, over half of the households meet the ALICE threshold, 58%. Hyde Park, 37%. So that's quite telling. Now, why am I showing you this modern data? All the people that make up these numbers are all employed. They're either in non-skilled or semi-skilled positions. The greater majority of the people who ended up in the old Alms house in the 19th and early 20th century were people who were in similar status. They were mostly day workers, farm laborers, farm hands, domestic servants. But since their work was not always guaranteed, they might end up in a state of poverty, spending some time at least in the Alms house, or at the very least, they needed some form of outdoor relief. I gave you a mixed selection of stories, everything from servants to soldiers to orphans to elderly. But the vast majority of people who ended up here were really just people who had run out of luck, which can happen to anyone at any time for any number of reasons. So I show you this to prove there is truth in the old saying that the more things change, the more they stay the same. While it would be nice to end this presentation on a cheerful note, it's not really possible. In these challenging times that we live in, we find that the struggle to steer clear of poverty, or even the harder task of pulling oneself out of poverty, doesn't really change no matter what century we're in. And I thank you very much for your time.